Wyoming Territory, July 1884. The sun had just dipped behind the Bighorn Mountains when the girl with bare feet stepped out of the cottonwood grove, blood on her ankle and fear in her eyes. Cassian Vaughn swung down from his horse before she even saw him. He had been riding east with a pack mule full of supplies, tracking a storm that never came. The girl froze when she spotted him, arms tight around her chest, her dress torn at the hem and coated in dust. Her feet were scratched raw from walking. "You hurt?" Cassian asked, voice low. She didn't answer, just looked at him like he might vanish if she blinked. Her lips trembled, but she stood tall. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he added, taking a slow step forward. "Name's Cassian Vaughn. I got water, blanket. You can sit if you want." She swayed a little, then collapsed onto the dirt. Cassian caught her before she hit the ground. Her name was Aveline Sutton. She told him the rest the next morning, sitting by his fire, wrapped in his extra coat. Her voice was hoarse but steady. Her father had died the winter before, leaving her alone on a dry patch of land east of Powder River. She had been trying to hold onto the homestead until 2 days ago, when a cattleman named Roy Lander came through demanding she sell. When she refused, he and 2 men came back at sundown. She ran barefoot into the hills that night with nothing but the clothes on her back. "I thought I could loop around to town," she said, "but I got turned around in the dark." Cassian stirred the beans in the pan. "You came near 30 miles. I know." He looked over at her, sitting stiff and proud with dirt still streaked down her arms. Her ankles were wrapped in cloth he'd torn from his shirt. She had refused help at first until the pain made her blink hard. "You got anyone?" he asked. "No one left," he nodded once. "Then you stay with me, for now." Aveline looked over, eyes wary. "Why?" "Because you need help, and I got 2 hands." She stared at him for a long moment, then she nodded. They rode west together, slow through the hills. Cassian gave her his horse and led the mule. She never complained, even when the blisters on her feet split open again. She just watched the horizon and held the reins like she had something to prove. He learned quick that Aveline did not like silence unless she chose it. She asked questions. About his horse, the mule, his old work as a ranch hand down near Douglas. She did not ask about his family, and he did not ask about hers. But that second night, when they camped beside a creek running cold and fast under the moon, she sat beside him and said, "You ever lose everything in one day?" Cassian stared into the fire. "Yeah." She did not ask more. Just sat close, her shoulder near his, until the fire burned low and the night wrapped soft around them. By the 4th night they reached his cabin. It sat in a narrow gully between cottonwoods and rock, built solid from pine and stone. Cassian had not planned on sharing it with anyone. But when Aveline stepped inside and looked around, something in her face loosened. "This yours?" she asked. "Built it last year." She touched the table with her fingertips, the edge of the hearth, the thick wool blanket on the bed. "It's quiet here," she said. "That's the point." That night she lay on the bed. He took the floor. She did not argue. Cassian watched her settle into the space like she had always belonged. She swept the floor with a bundle of dried sage. She fixed his broken stew pot with wire and patience. She found a way to make bread over open flame, turning it golden and crisp. But most of all, she smiled. It came slow, like spring thaw, but it was real. Not the kind of smile you fake to survive. The kind that came from sun on your face and a safe roof and someone handing you a mug of coffee before you asked. One afternoon, she stood outside in the grass, barefoot again, her toes curling in the warm dirt. Her hair was down, catching the wind. Cassian leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her. "You gonna keep doing that?" he asked. She turned, squinting against the sun. "Doing what?" "Running around barefoot like a wild thing," she grinned. "You got a problem with it?" "No," he said honestly. "Just wondering if I need to chase off rattlers." She laughed, and it hit him square in the chest. Like a memory he never had, that night a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked over the hills, and Aveline came to stand beside his bedroll, her hair damp from the rain that slipped in through the roof. "Cassian," she whispered. He sat up. "You all right?" She knelt down beside him. I do not like storms. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Her fingers were cold. Lie down, he said gently. You can stay here tonight. She hesitated, then slipped under the blanket beside him. The cabin creaked above them, her back pressed against his chest, tense at first, then softening. You're safe, he whispered, his voice low against the shell of her ear. I promise, Aveline, you're safe with me. She turned, buried her face in his neck, his arms wrapped around her without thinking. Let me hold you tonight, he whispered into her hair, and every night after. She did not answer with words, but her hand slid across his chest, her breath slowed. And in the dark, Cassian knew she had let him in. The next morning she cooked breakfast barefoot, humming under her breath. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back into him, no hesitation. You meant what you said, she asked. Every word, he said. You belong here with me. She turned in his arms, her eyes were bright, skin warm from the fire. Then I am staying, she said. Cassian Vaughn, you are stuck with me. He kissed her then, not soft, not careful, like a man who had waited too long. She kissed him back just the same. And outside, the storm clouds broke apart, letting the sun back through. The weeks drifted by with the hush of wind through pine boughs and the steady rhythm of work. July bled into August, and the hills turned gold under the sun's hard gaze. Cassian woke each morning to the sound of Aveline moving about, never hurried, never idle, and he found he liked that sound more than silence. She had a way of occupying a space like she belonged to it, like she'd carved out her place and wasn't about to be moved. One morning, she was outside before dawn, kneeling in the patch of earth near the cabin that had once been choked with weeds. She was pressing seeds into the soil, her braid tucked over one shoulder, her shoulders squared with quiet purpose. Cassian stepped onto the porch, pulling his suspenders over his shirt. You aiming to start a garden or bury treasure? I found wild beans and squash up past the bend, she said without looking up. Figured there's no reason not to try. He crossed the clearing and crouched beside her. The dirt was still cool from the night. You always plant things in someone else's yard, she wiped her hands on her skirt. I don't see you doing anything with it. He let out a breath through his nose, almost a laugh. Fair enough. She looked at him then. You ever grow anything? Mostly just calluses. She smiled at that, but it was different than before, quieter, more like something shared. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, she'd marked the rows with stones and tied bits of twine to keep the rabbits out. He didn't say it aloud, but he found himself glancing at it each time he passed, wondering if anything would sprout. Later that day, she washed linens in the river while he split firewood behind the cabin. When the sun was high, she called to him from the porch. You got any books? Cassian wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. A few, mostly about horses and fence building. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. I don't mind what they're about. I just miss reading. I'll dig them out. She stepped back inside and he stood there a moment, axe still in hand. It hadn't occurred to him she might miss that sort of thing. He hadn't thought much about books since he was a boy sitting by his mother's rocking chair, tracing letters with a blunt pencil. That night, she sat in the corner with one of the books balanced in her lap, mouthing the words to herself. He didn't interrupt. Just watched the way her eyes moved, the tilt of her head when a passage caught her. Do you want me to read it out loud? She asked eventually. If you want to. She read 2 pages about saddle repairs and the wear patterns of reins. Her voice was steady, soft, edged with the cadence of someone remembering how to speak for pleasure instead of need. Afterward, they sat in silence. He reached out without thinking and brushed his fingers along her wrist just once. She didn't pull away. I used to read to my father when his eyes went bad, she said. He listened like every word mattered. Cassian let his hand settle on hers, palm to palm. Reckon it did. The next morning they rode out at first light. They needed salt, lead, and nails. The closest place to trade was a general store nestled along the southern edge of the Tongue River. 2 days' ride if you didn't linger. The store itself was nothing more than a squat wooden building with a faded sign, but it had what they needed: Most of the folk there kept to themselves. Aveline stayed close to Cassian as they walked the narrow aisle between shelves stacked with calico, lamp oil, and tins. She picked out a bundle of dried sage and a tiny pair of sewing shears. He added a box of cartridges and 2 sacks of flour. As they approached the counter, a man behind them spoke low. "Well now, Cass, didn't figure you for the marrying type." Cassian turned. The man was gray at the temples with a face gone slack from drink and years in the sun. Will Danner. Used to work fence beside him on a ranch outside Casper before things turned bad. She don't look like she's from around here, Will added, gaze sliding to Aveline. Cassian stepped between them. "She's with me." Will raised both hands, mock apologetic. "Didn't mean nothing. Just surprised is all." Cassian didn't answer. He waited until Will backed off, then turned to Aveline. Her eyes hadn't left the floor. They rode out before noon, leaving the store and its stairs behind. That night they camped beside a bluff where the river cut deep through the earth. Cassian handed her a cup of coffee, then sat beside her on the flat stone that held the warmth of the day. "You all right?" he asked. "I don't like the way he looked at me." "I didn't either." She sipped slowly. "I've had men look at me like that before. Like I'm something they already understand." His jaw tightened. "You ain't." She stared out across the water. "You didn't talk like that when we met." "I didn't know what to say yet." She turned toward him. "And now," he met her eyes, "now I know I'd follow you anywhere. You've got more grit than anyone I've known, and you make this place feel like something worth holding on to." She set down the tin cup, leaned into his side. "You didn't ask for me to come into your life," she said. "No," he said, resting his cheek against her hair. "But you did. And I'll never wish you hadn't." She took his hand and laid it over her heart, letting it rest there. "Then hold me," she whispered, "like you mean to stay." "I do," he said. "Let me hold you tonight and every night after." She didn't speak again, but she didn't have to. When they lay down in the grass, under stars sharp enough to cut, there was no wind. No sound but the river and the slow, steady rhythm of 2 hearts choosing the same beat. September came in with wood smoke in the air and the rustle of yellowing leaves. The days cooled and the nights dipped low enough that Cassian added another quilt to their bed. Aveline had mended it herself with scraps of old shirts, the stitches small and neat. She didn't mention it, but he noticed. On a morning thick with fog, she stood at the edge of the clearing with a rifle in her hands, her hair braided down her back. Cassian stepped out barefoot, boots in one hand. "You expecting company?" She didn't lower the rifle. "Something's been circling the coop. Coyote. Tracks are too wide." Cassian joined her, following her gaze to the tree line. "Bear, no prints, just the smell." She finally lowered the rifle, stayed up half the night listening. "Next time, wake me." She looked over at him. "You sleep harder than you think," he chuckled, pulling on his boots. "I'll set a trap near the fence." Aveline nodded, but her eyes lingered on the trees like she was trying to read something written in the spaces between the branches. Later, she returned with a handful of chokecherries and a bruise darkening just above her wrist. "You fall." "Branch snapped," she said, setting the berries in the bowl. "Didn't see it coming." He took her hand gently, thumb brushing the swollen skin. "You always this reckless when I ain't looking." She tilted her head. "Only when there's fruit involved." He kissed the inside of her wrist just once and her breath hitched. That afternoon, Cassian took the mule down toward the river for water. When he returned, the cabin smelled of ash and something faintly sweet. Aveline knelt at the hearth, coaxing a small pot of syrup from the berries she'd gathered. She didn't look up when he stepped inside. "I know it's not much, but it might be good on biscuits." He crouched beside her. "You always make something from nothing." "No," she said, stirring carefully. "Only when it matters." He reached for the back of her neck, his fingers sliding into her hair. "It matters." That night they ate by lantern light, the windows open to the breath of early autumn. Afterward, Aveline pulled an old tin box from beneath the bed. Inside were scraps of paper, a bit of charcoal, a short bladed knife, and a folded square of muslin. She laid the cloth flat on the table. Cassian leaned in, tracing the faded embroidery with his eyes. Your mother's, my own, she said. Did it when I was 12. Thought I'd marry a doctor and live in a house with glass windows. He smiled. Changed your mind, didn't have much choice. He picked up the cloth, smoothing it between his hands. You could still have the glass windows. She looked at him, quiet. You planning on building that kind of house? I'd build whatever you wanted, long as you'd be in it. She folded the cloth again, slower this time. You'd really want to stay put. He leaned back in his chair. I've roamed enough. Woke up in places I didn't remember riding into, but this feels like a place to stop. She studied him for a moment, then stood and crossed the room. Her hand slid beneath his jaw, fingers warm against his skin. Then let's stop here together. They didn't speak again that night. There was no need. Later, as they lay in bed, her back pressed against his chest, he whispered against her shoulder, "Let me hold you tonight and every night after." She turned in his arms, her face close enough that he could see the flecks in her eyes. I want that. He brushed his thumb along her cheek. Then it's yours. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. Inside, they held each other like nothing beyond those walls could touch them. The wind shifted by mid-October, bringing with it the bite of the high country. Cassian stood at the edge of the shed roof, hammer in hand, his breath threading white into the morning air. Below, Aveline stacked dry cedar branches in a broad tin basin, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, fingers red from the cold. You'll split your hands open, he said, climbing down the ladder. She looked up, cheeks flushed. They'll toughen. Cassian took the axe from its hook. Let me finish, you warm up inside. Aveline didn't argue, just tipped her chin and stepped toward the porch. She paused at the door. The garden's holding. I saw shoots this morning. He let himself smile. You were right to plant. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine pitch and damp wool. The iron stove breathed heat into the walls, and Aveline sat by it with her legs folded beneath her, sewing patches into the lining of a coat Cassian hadn't worn since last winter. Her concentration was exact, but her fingers moved slower than usual. You're tired, he said, setting the axe near the hearth. I didn't sleep. He crouched beside her. Why not? There was a sound, like hooves, but too slow. Cassian rested his hand on her knee. I'll ride out in the morning. Check the ridgeline. I don't want something creeping too close. It won't. She looked at him like she wanted to believe it. He brushed a curl behind her ear. You trust me? I do, she said softly. But I still listen for what might come. That night, the wind rattled the shutters, and Cassian kept his rifle propped beside the bed. Aveline curled tight against his chest, her hands beneath the quilt, her breathing shallow but steady. He didn't sleep either. At sunrise, he saddled the gelding and left without waking her. The frost was thick in the low brush, and the trail west bent through pale grass and sparse birches. He saw no tracks, no signs of trespass. But near a flat rock outcrop, he found a length of chewed rope, frayed and stiff with age. It didn't belong to either of them. He pocketed it and turned back. When he returned, Aveline met him at the barn. She was dressed in a navy wool skirt and her father's old belt cinched at the waist, her hair pinned up under a scarf. Did you find anything? Piece of rope. Too old to be fresh. She took it from his hand, turning it over. Mule rope, not ours. Likely dropped by someone passing through. Not many come this way. No, Cassian said, watching her face. They don't. She walked to the fence, resting her arms on the rail. I used to think if I just kept quiet and worked hard, the world would leave me alone. That ever work? No, she said, but I kept trying anyway. He stepped behind her, his hands sliding along her back. You don't have to try that here. She leaned back into him. I know. They stood like that for a while, the horses chewing hay behind them, the sun rising slow over the ridge. When the wind shifted, Aveline turned in his arms. You ever want more? She asked. Then this, he thought for a moment, then shook his head. I want the roof to hold, the land to stay ours, and you beside me when the fire burns low. That's enough. She reached up, touching his jaw. It's enough for me too. Later that week, Cassian brought home a bundle of fencing wire and a sack of barley seed. Aveline met him at the porch, wiping flour from her hands. "You planning something?" she asked, eyeing the sack. "Next spring. Might try planting more than beans. You're thinking ahead. I'm thinking of us." They spent the rest of the day mending the fence that bordered the eastern slope. Aveline worked steadily, her palms calloused from weeks of labor, her braid tucked into her collar. As the sun lowered, she paused, leaning against a post. "You ever think about naming this place?" Cassian looked over. "Never did." "Well," she said, "it's got a name in my head now." "What is it?" she smiled. "Haven." He nodded once, the words settling into his chest like a stone in still water. "Then that's what it is." That night, after the dishes were done and the fire banked low, Aveline sat at the table with a scrap of paper and a bit of charcoal. She wrote the word in careful script Haven, then folded the paper and tucked it into the rafters. Cassian watched her from the bed, blanket pulled back, the lamplight catching the curve of her cheek. "You coming to sleep?" "In just a minute." He waited. When she joined him, she pressed close, her bare feet against his shins. "Let me hold you tonight," he whispered, voice rough from wind and quiet hours, "and every night after." She exhaled against his chest. "You already do." And when the fire died down and the dark wrapped close around them, they stayed wrapped in each other, warm against the coming cold. By early November, frost held to the grass until midday, and the creek behind the cabin wore a thin skin of ice each morning. Cassian had begun hauling in the last of the firewood before the ground froze solid, while Aveline turned her attention to the walls inside, patching the chinks with a mix of clay and straw, dragging her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she worked. One afternoon, as Cassian returned from checking snares near the ridge, he found her outside with a length of buckskin spread over a flat stone. She was stitching a sleeve onto a winter shirt, her fingers stiff from cold but still precise. Two blue jays fought overhead in the cottonwoods, their cries sharp above the hush of wind through the bare branches. "You're making that for me?" Cassian asked, setting his rifle against the porch rail. She didn't look up. "You've worn the same two shirts since August." "I figured it was time." He stepped closer, crouching beside her. "You always make things better without waiting to be asked." "I never saw much use in waiting." He reached out and touched the fabric. "It's warm." "It'll be warmer with lining," she said, and her voice softened. "I've been saving wool scraps for weeks." Cassian didn't speak. He just watched her work, her brow slightly furrowed, her mouth drawing into a quiet line of concentration. He knew better than to interrupt her rhythm. Instead, he stood and went to the shed, returning with a pair of fur-lined gloves he'd traded for early in the year. When he handed them to her, she hesitated. "These are yours." "They're yours now." She slipped them on, flexed her fingers once, and smiled without lifting her eyes. They fit. Later that evening, after the lamps were doused and the fire banked low, Aveline lay with her head on Cassian's chest, her breath warm against his skin. Cold seeped through the cabin walls, but under the quilts, she was soft and close, her hand resting over his ribs. "You ever think about what comes after winter?" she asked. He ran his hand slowly down her back. "You mean spring?" "I mean the years." He was quiet a moment. "I think about planting more, building on the shed, maybe taking a few cows up from town." She tilted her head. "I think about planting too, not just food, I mean trees, things that last." He turned his face toward her hair. "What kind of trees?" "Apple, maybe plum." "My father used to say a tree's a promise, something you won't live to see full grown, but you plant it anyway." He considered that. "Then we ought to plant some." The next day, they took the wagon down to a small settlement near the Tongue River, where a traveling merchant had set up crates of seedling trees and bundled rootstock. The man was toothless and smelled of pipe smoke, but he had saplings wrapped in burlap and tied with twine. Cassian bought 3, 2 apple and 1 plum. Aveline carried them home on her lap, cradled like something fragile and precious. They planted them near the creek bank, where the sun fell longest in the day. Aveline dug carefully, her sleeves rolled high, Cassian steadying the young trunks as she covered the roots with earth. When they stood together afterward, hands muddy, she looked at him and said, "That's the first thing we've planted together." He wiped his palms on his trousers. It won't be the last. By December, the garden had gone to sleep beneath a cover of straw and the land lay still under thin snow. Inside, Aveline spent her evenings at the hearth, carding raw wool she'd traded for with extra bread and sewing. Cassian carved a small shelf for her books, then surprised her with a thick ledger from town. "For writing," he said, placing it in her lap, her eyes widened. "You think I should? I think your words are worth saving." She opened the book that night and began with a simple line, her hand steady. "This is what it feels like to stay." One morning, near the end of the year, Cassian came in from the barn to find her standing by the window, her hands folded beneath her shawl. She didn't turn when he entered. "There's something I need to say." He stepped closer. "All right." She faced him slowly. "I was scared when I first came here, not just of being chased or lost. I was scared of belonging to something again, of what it would mean if I stayed. And now, I still feel it sometimes. But when I wake up next to you, when I hear your boots on the porch, when I see smoke from our chimney, I know I made the right choice." Cassian closed the distance between them, took her face in both hands. "You changed everything," he said. "This place was just walls and quiet before you." She pressed her forehead to his. "I want to marry you." His breath caught. "You sure?" "I am." "Then come spring," he said, "we'll ride into town and do it proper." "No," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I mean now, here. Just us." He looked around the cabin, at the fire, the worn table, the scent of bread in the air, then back to her. "All right," he said. "Here, then." They stood in the center of the room, no witnesses, no preacher. Just the two of them, hands clasped, with the trees outside bowing under snow and the stove crackling low. "I take you," she whispered, "and I'll take you every day after." "And I'm yours," he said, "now and always." They kissed slow and sure, and the cabin held its breath around them. That night they shared the bed like always, but something had shifted, something grounded and real beneath the hush of the wind outside. Months passed. The snow melted and the trees budded with tiny leaves. The garden sprouted again, stronger than before. Cassian built a new fence around the orchard, and Aveline started keeping a journal by the window. Their days were filled with work, and their nights with warmth, and the rhythm they found was quiet and sure. One morning, as Cassian saddled the gelding to ride to the mill, Aveline came out with a hand resting lightly over her stomach. "There's something you should know," she said. He looked at her, eyes narrowing. "I think we'll need a second cradle come winter." He stepped forward, touched her belly, then looked into her eyes. "You sure?" She nodded. "I am." He pulled her into his arms, held her close, and whispered into her hair, "Then everything we planted's growing." Their orchard bloomed that season, white petals over the creek like snow returning. And in the cabin called Haven, two people who had once believed they had nothing left found everything they needed in each other. They never sought more than the life they built together, and it was enough. And when the first apple ripened 3 years later, Aveline picked it with one hand, a child on her hip and another chasing chickens through the grass, her heart full and steady. Cassian watched from the porch, a second cradle beside him, and knew they had, at long last, come home.